Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar with Real Story Group. My name is Scott Dill, and with me is our founder, Tony Byrne, along with our VP of Research and Advisory, Apoorv Durga. And today we're going to be walking you through our hottest research area, I would say, which is the customer data platform space. So today, Tony and Apoorv are going to walk through some of the key trends to watch in the coming year and beyond. And we really do appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us for this 30-minute presentation. We will have some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, you can enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And then a recording and the slides from this presentation will be available within the next few days. So I do see some new names on the list. Thank you again for joining us. For those of you that are not familiar with the Real Story Group, we're an industry analyst firm, and we take a really unique approach in this space in terms of how we work with the vendors, in that we don't do any work for the vendors we cover in any way, shape, or form. And when Tony founded this company 20 plus years ago, he did so along the lines of a Consumer Reports, where our only focus is on technology users and buyers. And so as such, we never work for the vendors we cover. We never advise them on their strategy or present at their conferences or anything like that. So our only focus is on helping you to make the right decisions when you're looking to make important technology choices. And today we're going to look at the CDP marketplace. And with that, I'll turn things over to Tony and Apoorv to walk you through our coverage areas and the CDP space in particular. Guys?
Great. Thanks, Scott. Apoorv and I are really excited to be here with you all. I'll start it off and then hand it over to Apoorv. So you may have seen this map before, where this is a subway or tube map of all the different vendors that RSG covers, labeled across different lines, which are each marketplaces. And so the customer data platform marketplace is the orange line here. And like a lot of these marketplaces, there's this kind of center where you have major vendors like Salesforce and Oracle and Adobe who have solutions, and then this incredible periphery of independent vendors who have been at this for a long time and have some impressive solutions as well. So it's a highly fragmented marketplace, a lot of dynamism in this marketplace. I would argue probably the most dynamic of all the ones that we cover. And so it's really interesting then to sort of think about what are the trends. So we've got 5 trends for you here today. I'm going to cover number 1 and then hand it over to Apoorv for 2 and 3. And this one is really big, and you'll see that a lot of other trends kind of fall out of this, which is the CDP market is bifurcating. It's bifurcating between those vendors that are fundamentally more processing or infrastructure oriented, and those that are more activation or marketing and business oriented. It's not an exact, it's more of a spectrum than an exact, put pieces here or there, although we'll try to do that. But I wanted to just explain a little bit how this happened and how it got here. So this was sort of the original model of a CDP, which was, in a sense, almost a kind of a data ecosystem in a box, where you had all this first-party data, zero-party data, second and third-party data potentially, all going into this mixing bowl where it would be processed, identities would be resolved, a lot of data cleaning and ETL, but then also on the marketing side, doing a lot of segmentation and event processing and potentially even some reporting and analytics. So really kind of a one-size-fits-all. And there are still some vendors sort of pursuing this today. I think this was the original vision of it and what a lot of different vendors targeted. What they realized over time was, particularly as larger enterprises started looking at this and data teams started paying more attention, to say, whoa, wait a second, logically a lot of different things are going on here, and maybe we ought to divide this into a more of a data ops versus marketing ops type model, where it's the responsibility of data ops to do all the really complicated customer data ingest and processing, like ingest, transform, clean, process, unify being a big one. Creating an identity graph, and that this was fundamentally kind of a process hub type work, as opposed to marketing and other CX ops doing the orange bit in the middle here, which was really the activation piece. very different user experience required, very different personas, very different set of activities. And so the question becomes, you know, if you're a CDP vendor, which side of these do you emphasize, and could you even potentially do both? I'll argue it's very difficult to do both of these things in a single platform for a variety of different reasons. And so this has then really played out in the marketplace. And so what we have here, as analysts are wont to do, we've got vendors sitting in these hard boxes. Again, in the reality is that a three-dimensional view of this would be much more complicated. There's more to say here. So this is I'll just concede this is a little bit of an oversimplification. But if you look at the independents, which are the three boxes on the right, they have traditionally dominated the market and still do today. There's a little bit of a dividing line between, again, the more processing-oriented independents, many of whom self-identify as customer data infrastructure. And then on the right, you have the more activation-oriented independents, some of which are very aggressively moving into decisioning. Now, again, there's some subtle differences among this, but roughly speaking, you can kind of divide the marketplace this way. And so I think this is going to be foundational going forward as well, and to some extent helps you as a customer simplify your choices. So I think what we're also seeing here, and this is a subtext over all 5 of our trends, is that the marketplace is maturing. Now over here, we're being on the far left where we talk about the MarTech suite dependent ones, we're being a little bit orthogonal because we're getting out of this sort of processor versus marketer bifurcation. It turns out that most of these vendors are sort of drifting towards a more activation-oriented model because they're working with large enterprises that already have a lot of the processing taken care of in their customer data infrastructure. So, but that's not always the case. We make them separate because we think there's somewhat of a muddled marketplace among the MarTech suite dependent, that their CDP vendors are actually relatively weak and parochial and tend to connect the different platforms within that MarTech vendor's own stack as opposed to being a truly independent layer in your stack. So we're looking at those vendors a little bit askance. You can take a look at our research to get more details on that. So one of the interesting things is that in the processing-oriented vendors, you know, there's a lot of them have very aggressively moved on a very complicated process, which is identity resolution and identity stitching. Whereas on the right hand of the diagram here, a lot of these vendors sort of assume that, at least for your known visitors, that you've already done all of the core identity resolution. And so this then becomes a pretty important topic all the way around, and it's become more relevant, I think, in the emerging cookieless world. So Apoorv has a kind of an important trend to talk about here: identity resolution beyond the CDP problem space. So Apoorv, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. So for some reasons, I don't see the slides, only videos, but I will use my own copy and imagine that you are traversing it at my speed. Okay. Right? So I remember it pretty well, so that's fine, I think. So the slide that Tony showed of the emerging CDP model had identities and data enrichment related features. Now, in fact, the identities and data enrichment have been a big part of what CDPs traditionally offered. So this includes capabilities such as identity resolution using both deterministic and probabilistic matching for both known as well as unknown set of users. And then there were adjacent capabilities such as data enrichment and so on. However, a lot of CDP vendors have realized that identity management and identity resolution are very tough problems to crack. And we increasingly see CDPs handing over some part of it to external vendors. In fact, data onboarding has fast emerged as a separate category. It's a big category in itself, and there are several ways to slice and dice the landscape of vendors, right? So first one is based on data sources. So some vendors specialize in onboarding data from specific sources such as online and offline data, CRM data, or social media data. Then they differentiate based on different data types. So some vendors specialize in onboarding specific types of data such as email, mobile, or postal addresses. And then there is this large category called services. So a lot of vendors offer a wide range of services, including data acquisition, data cleaning, data matching, and data activation, while other vendors may specialize in one or two of these services. Then there is industry focus. So some of these data onboarding vendors focus on healthcare. Some have solutions for finance or retail or telecom. And then they differentiate based on whether they support B2B or B2C. Now, B2B, as you know, has two parts to it, professional as well as organizational, whereas B2C has individual and households. There are some similarities between households and B2B, but they are still different. In doing all this, we have seen that an MDM still remains as the core component for managing first-party profiles.
Yeah, and I'll just here and add that this is a little bit, this might be controversial among some CDP vendors who would claim to be able to do this MDM for you. We think for a large enterprise, you probably want to decouple your MDM provider from your CDP provider. So yeah, moving on to slide 10, Apoor, with the different service categories.
Yeah, thanks. So this slide shows a sampling of some major vendors for each of these categories. As you can see, there are lots of them, right? Lots of vendors. Now, I will admit that it's not black and white, and there are lots of shades of gray, meaning there are often overlaps. So this categorization can keep changing. But nevertheless, I think this could serve as a handy list of criteria while evaluating this platform. I mean, the first column, which is category, this is essentially a list of capabilities that you could use to evaluate these vendors. Now, we regularly see our CDP customers using their CDPs along with several of these products and tools mentioned on this slide. So something that was a core part of CDPs is slowly getting beyond what CDPs do. And that brings me to the next trend, which is composability. Right, so there's a lot of buzz and everyone from suite vendors to single feature point solutions are claiming they are composable. Right, in fact, some even tout composability as a differentiator and a modern approach for building your own data fabric. But we argue that composability is not really new, and there are different levels of composability instead. So by nature, modern data stacks are composable. So as you move from left to right, which is from suite bolt-ons to packaged best of breed to componentized and maybe even beyond to complete DIY, the granularity of composability increases. So initially, as this graph shows, as the granularity increases, you get more in terms of functionality and capabilities. But a further increase in composability or granularity only brings diminishing returns in terms of out-of-the-box functionality, although you could get a more purpose-built solution. So which of these two approaches, which of these three approaches, suite versus BOB versus componentized, is good for us? There are no standard answers, but this slide provides a framework for figuring out which approach is more suitable for you, right? So there are various trade-offs and how each of these approaches can impact your CDP complexity, fit to purpose, range of functionality, total cost of ownership, and ease of implementation. You can see that each of these approaches has its pros and cons. For example, a best of breed CDP provides support for a broad range of use cases and allows you to scale up to add support for additional use cases gradually. The componentized approach, on the other hand, allows you to build something specific to your current requirement. It may be easy to start with. For example, have you heard from vendors who say we can get your data from Snowflake and send it to your email platform in 5 minutes, right? But as your requirements become more sophisticated, you need more pieces, more parts to it, making your stack even more complex. So while you can be selective and choose to build exactly what you need, remember that to some degree you are actually building software here, and what's interesting for a developer may not be optimal for your business stakeholders. A topic that is often adjacent to composability discussion is that of data warehouses, or specifically cloud data warehouses. We are on slide 14, Tony, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So data warehouses come very often into discussions when there are discussions about composability. In fact, direct ingestion from cloud data warehouses such as Snowflake is the in thing these days. So why not then use your data warehouse as the CDP? Now, proponents of this approach suggest that most enterprises already have some sort of data warehouse and or a data lake. So instead of copying data over from DWH into a CDP, why not just use your DWH as your CDP? Remember that DWH is the data warehouse is not really a CDP, right? It was not built for doing those kind of things. So using your DWH as a CDP requires several other components to build a CDP-like layer. So at the very minimum, you would need some sort of a reverse ETL tool to pull data out of your data warehouse and then push it to your activation channels. But that's not really sufficient, right? You would also need components for other capabilities that a CDP provides. So for example, data ingestion, right? Snowflake cannot ingest data on its own. You will need several other tools to ingest data into it. Identity resolution, data quality management, marketer friendly segmentation, triggers, activations, orchestration, and the list goes on and on, right? So you are essentially building a broad platform, something that we already discussed a couple of slides back, right? But having said that, what's certainly emerging is that cloud warehouses are increasingly becoming important for your overall data fabric. They may or may not act as a CDP, but they are certainly an important component of an overall data model or an overall data architecture. And so they play an important role as a source of customer data, right? So our enterprise clients have had this requirement for a long time, and we see more and more of them relying on their data fabric and not just CDP for many core data management capabilities, right? So there are three approaches that we have seen being popular, getting popular these days. The first approach is platforms such as Braze and Message Gears, who've recently announced their integration framework, and they can pull data directly from data warehouse. The second approach is what some reverse ETL tools and some CDPs do. So they use data warehouse as a repository of data and then provide additional capabilities that a CDP does, or in case of reverse ETL, provide capabilities for transformation and then pushing it to marketing platform. And finally, the third approach is of using a CDP in conjunction with a data warehouse. So you either sync or duplicate data from your data warehouse. Now there are several considerations that you can think of while deciding which approach works for you. Of course, there is no set answer here again, right? So some of the considerations are mentioned on this slide, right? So the first one is about real-time use cases. Now data warehouses are just not meant for real-time use cases, right? So you will need to build additional capabilities to get to that, and your approach 1 or even approach 2 may not be suitable for that. Similarly, you need to figure out what happens to other capabilities. So where do you want to do ID resolution, data ingestion, DQM, segmentation, etc. Now in approach 1 and approach 2, you are essentially sending data from data warehouse to your marketing platform without actually copying it anywhere, right? So you have to think where does segmentation happen? Are you going to be doing segmentation in each of the individual marketing platforms? If you were going to do that, your omni-channel customer experience just goes for a toss, because you're essentially replicating that thing in each of the end user platforms. Is the data model of your data warehouse suitable for activation use cases? That's another important consideration. And finally, what about marketers' usability? You don't want marketers to remember table names and attributes and then running SQLs on top of that, right? So based on these considerations, you can decide which approach works for you. You may need a combination of these approaches or one of these approaches, but these are the approaches that we see being talked about a lot these days.
Yeah, and you know, this is really a trend that's going to continue through this year, and I'm sure we'll probably have a slightly different take on it in 2024 because this market is definitely evolving very quickly. But you know, one of the things that you mentioned, Apoorv, around pricing is really interesting, that because there are different cost models associated here about where the compute happens, and that's also beginning to really inflect the CDP market as a whole. Is that we are seeing some pricing shifts now. I'll switch gears here for a second and just remind everyone on the call that if you have any questions or any comments or any vignettes you'd like to share, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and you can go ahead and submit that in at any time, and then we'll have some time at the end to address that. So pricing, you know, when we talked about sort of version 1 of the industry, I think we're now in maybe version 3, but the old way of pricing was, roughly speaking, based on the size of your repository. In other words, how many customer records do you have? And so there would be these funny dances where people were constantly rotating data in and out of their CDP. The benefit to this as an enterprise is that this was very predictable and simple, to the extent that it wasn't necessarily aligned with vendor costs. They weren't necessarily caring because most, if not all, of these vendors had venture capital, and they were really in customer acquisition mode and not necessarily in path to profitability. Now we are in a kind of a different world that's evolving where, yeah, the size of your repository still matters, and that's how vendors will determine at least part of the pricing. But I think they have discovered that their own costs are really associated a lot around the actual data processing. So not so much storage, not so much throughput, but when do they have to start processing and cycling against your data? So writing it, activating it, doing heavy duty stitching and that sort of thing. And so, and all this is in the context of course, a macroeconomic shift where many enterprises are looking with more scrutiny about their costs, I'll say, but also in a maturing CDP vendor where they're going maybe less from customer acquisition and more towards path to profitability, that even those that are sitting on a lot of cash are really trying to do a better job of projecting their costs onto their customers. And so we've seen just a whole sea change in CDP vendor pricing. And the challenge for you is that the burden of variability and risk then often gets shifted to you. And what we're seeing in the CDP selection process is that vendors are forcing you to yourself to sort of figure out what your costs are, which is very difficult for you to say, you know, how often am I going to be updating this record? How often am I going to be activating these records? They sometimes have these coefficients where they're going to assume that, you know, a record might be updated 50 times a month on average, but it's very difficult to predict this in advance, and that risk is getting shifted to you. So and sometimes this is done as a proposal in the asterisk. So they may say, okay, for 200 million records, we're going to pay you X, Y, Z. But oh, by the way, the assumption is, and it's a big assumption, that there's going to be this much processing going on. And so this is really an important conversation to have, and to really force the vendors to come up with a whole set of menus. And it's not going to be one-dimensional, they're going to be two-dimensional, three-dimensional menus. They will resist this, but you have to insist to really understand what are the different tiers here that are going to invoke different costs on your behalf. The other thing that we're seeing, for those of you who are already licensing CDPs, is some sort of contract renewal shock where the vendor is saying, well, you know, we're going to put some other levers and governors and controls here based on what you can do. So this isn't necessarily new, you know, of course, Salesforce and others apply this licensing model, but it's something to be really aware of, and just understand if you're in the market for a CDP, you're going to need some time, potentially as much as a month or more during the selection process, to really work through some what-if scenarios. And unfortunately, you're going to have to push the vendor very hard to do things they don't want to do in terms of exposing their own pricing model. And two, by necessarily, they're going to push you really hard to work with them on what your projections might look like. So all this goes to say that you probably want an iterative selection process where you're not sort of rushing this conversation. And that's exactly what we're going to recommend. And I will confess right here, I'm going to talk about CDP selection here. This is not so much a trend, but maybe an aspiration. And I'll also concede that this is a very self-interested aspiration because, of course, this is what we help companies do, is understand the marketplace and help them select a product. But you really want to make sure that you figure out first and foremost the scope of a CDP. Most of you have seen this sort of generic reference model that we have that divides foundation services at the bottom and engagement and delivery services at the top. Of course, everybody is now trying to build up their core at the bottom, and CDP, potentially any given CDP could fill any number of these different boxes. So the first thing you need to do is, of course, understand the broad scope of what you're trying to do, but then really, rather than do a waterfall selection, which in this market I really discourage you, because the complexity of these platforms, both from a data and IT and architectural standpoint, and then let alone marketing usability and marketing effectiveness, is just super high. So you have to apply design thinking to this, make it very business focused, team-based, empirical, iterative, adaptive. My colleague Jared and I wrote a book about this that is essentially a cookbook for how to do this. We've been applying these recipes to CDP and finding it very effective. In particular, you want to have an iterative and very test-based selection process. We have other webinars on this that you can go take a look at. This is worth a whole half-hour discussion in and of itself. But the key thing is to make sure at the bottom that you have a hands-on bake-off, and almost always you want to have some sort of POC, maybe even with real data, before you decide on the bottom line, because there are a lot of issues here around potential cost spikes, around heavy needs for professional services to do the inevitable workarounds, a lot of issues around performance, and then what does that mean in terms of marketer expectation setting. So you really do want to follow a more agile and iterative and empirical selection process for any MarTech. This model really predates the CDP marketplace, but we found it's particularly effective in the CDP marketplace. When RSG evaluates vendors, and we evaluate 30 CDP vendors in our research, we take, as we do in any marketplace, a scenario-based approach. In other words, what are you trying to do? We talked about architecture, we talked about a selection process, but now really, what are you trying to get out of this platform? What value are you trying to support? And so, we break it up into 10 different scenarios. And I'm here to tell you that the typical CDP vendor is only going to concentrate on 2, 3, or 4 of these, may have a story around 2 or 3 others. So it's really important to sort of make sure in your shortlist that you map your needs against what the vendor's traditional strengths. And of course, we've got tooling on our website for, if you're a subscriber, to just have to help you do that, to help you auto-generate a real a quadrant that is reflective of your particular business context. So to summarize the trends, the CDP market is bifurcating between those that focus on processing and infrastructure and those that focus on business activation. Identity resolution is really coming to the fore as an essential component of this, and there's a mixture of potential solutions out there, and it's a question of really identifying what capabilities do you need within the CDP, and as Apoorv mentioned, increasingly external to the CDP. Composability is a buzzword. The reality is that it can be difficult to decompose what a CDP does, and at the same time, though, you don't want a CDP to duplicate a lot of capabilities that you already have in your stack. Definitely a pricing shift. This is pushing some risk from the vendors to you, and so you want to be thinking very hard about this, but also understand that you're going to need weeks of time going back and forth with the vendors to truly understand what the pricing is. And you want to do that in a competitive context, not after you selected them. And so that means having a more methodical selection process that gives you the time to negotiate while you're still in a competitive situation. So with that, we've seen a couple questions flow in, but while Apoorv and I are looking at that, we'll let Scott explained to you potential next steps. I wanted to just point out there's several ways to work with us. You can license our CDP research. You can get in the second category here, full stack, which is subscribe to all of this stuff. And then the third is to point out that we have this MarTech Executive Council. We just met yesterday, top leaders of large MarTech organizations around the world talking and sharing their examples on personalization, what was working, what's not. It was fabulous. We're going to be meeting again in person in May in Chicago for 2 days of intense lesson sharing amid good food and drink. So if you're interested in that, please do talk to Scott. And here is Scott to tell you about potential next steps.
Great, thanks, Tony and Apoorv. And yes, happy to share more details about whether it's the research you're interested in or learning more about the Leadership Council. Just reach out to us at the email address here, explore@realstorygroup.com, and we can set up a time to walk you through that. You can also download excerpts from the CDP research or any other areas we cover and take a look at the in-depth analysis that Tony referred to with those use cases. Finally, our next webinar is going to be in 2 weeks. The focus for that will be web content management. So if you or any of your colleagues are looking at potentially selecting a new web content management system this year, join us March 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern. I'll turn it back over to you guys for the questions that have come in.
Thanks, Apoorv. I'm going to kind of challenge you with this first one. It's a long question. I'll read it out here, and hopefully we can keep the answer to a minute and a half. But Jens is asking, an interesting aspect is to understand your view on omni-channel experience consistency in a marketing context and with the composable CDP. Concretely, how can I best with a composable CDP, data warehouse plus reverse ETL plus other stuff, create a consistent customer experience both inbound and outbound without a manual setup? For me, this is the aspect of a main differentiator of an orchestration CDP type. So basically, Jens is scratching at that issue that you raised, Apoorv, is how do I get omni-channel consistency if I'm doing all this spaghetti integration from using reverse ETL? Any thoughts on that? Apoorv, are you with us?
There are several components of omni-channel experience, right? And the idea is to be consistent across all channels. Now, with an approach where there is no, so some of the components of that omni-channel includes things like ability to create personalization rules or activation which are consistent across channels, ability to have segments that work across channels, ability to send segments from your platform to multiple channels. Right now, if you want to do all of that with an approach where you don't have a middleware or a middle platform or something like that, it is going to be very, very tough especially with approach 1 and approach 2, right?
Yeah.
Specifically in the approach 1 that we show, a lot of marketing platforms are suggesting that they can pull data directly from Snowflake, and then you do segmentation within those platforms. Now, if you had 10 such platforms, are you going to be doing segmentation in each of those 10 platforms? If you were doing that, then your omni-channel is already gone for a toss, right? So it is going to be very difficult using those approaches.
That's a great summary. Thanks. I mean, there's more to say there, but that was really, thank you, Apoorv. That was a super kind of 1-minute distillation. Florian, I'll ask your question, then we'll need to wrap up. Is RSG looking at new use cases for CDPs with market and technology dynamics, regulation, third-party cookie, et cetera? And yes, Florian, obviously third-party cookies going away has meant that media use cases have really risen to the fore, leveraging first-party data, and there's a lot to say there, but I think CDPs are inevitably going to become DMP replacements. The other interesting use cases that are coming in are across non-marketing use cases, so customer service, sometimes even some operational use cases where they need where whatever the frontline application is, needs ready access to an authoritative customer data store. You're crossing the Rubicon there once you leave the marketing domain, but you're also, because there's a lot of complexity there that comes into play that wouldn't be if you were just looking at marketing. But on the other hand, there's potential trove of CX and other value that can come out of that. So unfortunately, our time is running out, and we need to head off here, but wanted to thank everyone on behalf of the RSG team, Scott, Apoorv, and I, for joining, and wish you a great rest of your week. Bye now.
Bye.